From the very first second, the narrator's voice drops into that calm but tense tone, the kind that tells viewers they're about to hear something they weren't prepared for. They explain how everything exploded the moment Piper Ale posted her exclusive content link, not quietly, not secretly, but publicly and boldly, like someone announcing a major brand drop rather than a life-changing decision. The narrator talks about how the internet froze for a moment, almost confused, because even though everyone technically saw this coming, nobody expected it to arrive this fast. They describe how comment sections started flooding instantly, people arguing about what pushed her to take this step, while others insisted the signs were obvious long before today. Instead of treating this as a shocking twist, the narrator makes it clear that this moment didn't appear out of thin air. It was a chain reaction years in the making. And as the narrator leans in, they hint that this wasn't some impulsive move or rebellious outburst. This was the result of a long, slow buildup that almost everyone noticed, but no one stopped. The narrator shifts into a reflective tone, the kind that sounds like someone replaying events in their head and realizing the truth they ignored. They explain how this entire situation grew slowly, quietly, almost casually, as she spent more and more time around creators who were already entrenched in that world. The narrator points out how strange it always felt to see someone still considered a child surrounded by grown adults whose careers revolved around fan-based content, and yet every concern was brushed aside. Even when people left comments warning that the environment didn't feel right or that the dynamic felt off, those warnings were dismissed as overreactions. The narrator describes it like watching a car rolling toward the edge of a cliff in slow motion, with everyone yelling but no one steering. And by the time viewers look back on those moments, the pattern becomes painfully clear. This wasn't an accident, it was a progression. The narrator then turns toward the most uncomfortable part of the story. Their voice becomes heavier as they explain the controversy surrounding Sophie Rain, one of the biggest adult content creators online, who had been appearing with Piper long before she was legally an adult. They describe how fans dug into Sophie's age and discovered she was actually in her mid-20s, not early 20s as many believed. And suddenly, the entire friendship people once viewed as fun and harmless took on a darker undertone. The narrator describes the growing discomfort viewers felt as they realized a grown woman, deeply established in the very industry Piper just entered, had been spending so much time with her during her last years as a minor. Then the narrator explains something even more unsettling: the way Sophie seemed to be guiding Piper into the same career path, intentionally or not. And when you connect those details with Piper's sudden launch, the narrator says, it becomes harder to call this coincidence. It starts to look like influence. It starts to look like preparation. Here, the narrator emphasizes how calculated the rollout felt. Instead of describing Piper as unsure or experimenting, they frame it like a fully mapped-out business move. They explain how she offered free trials, how she promoted the launch with promotional-style language, and how she talked about earnings like someone already deep in the industry. The narrator points out that a launch this smooth, this polished, doesn't come from someone dipping their toes in the water. It comes from planning. They also explain the financial pressure behind it. Her main YouTube income was shrinking, her ad revenue was hit, and brands were becoming hesitant. So when she turned 18, the timing felt too perfect to ignore. The narrator makes it clear that this wasn't spontaneous, this wasn't last minute, this was something waiting in the shadows, ready to go live. The narrator takes a more somber tone as they describe how quickly the situation spiraled. They talk about content leaking onto Reddit within hours, screenshots reposted, commentary threads erupting, people spreading her images as if they were pieces of entertainment rather than pieces of someone's real life. The narrator doesn't describe the images themselves, but focuses on the disturbing behavior around them, explaining how comments became predatory, how empathy seemed to evaporate, and how the online world stripped Piper of her humanity. They highlight the cruelty of treating a teenager like a trending topic, not a person who grew up under a microscope. And as they speak, they underline how predictable yet still heartbreaking it was to watch the internet turn a vulnerable moment into a spectacle. The narrator takes a more somber tone as they describe how quickly the situation spiraled. They talk about content leaking onto Reddit within hours, screenshots reposted, commentary threads erupting, people spreading her images as if they were pieces of entertainment rather than pieces of someone's real life. The narrator doesn't describe the images themselves, but focuses on the disturbing behavior around them, explaining how comments became predatory, how empathy seemed to evaporate, and how the online world stripped Piper of her humanity. They highlight the cruelty of treating a teenager like a trending topic, not a person who grew up under a microscope. And as they speak, they underline how predictable yet still heartbreaking it was to watch the internet turn a vulnerable moment into a spectacle. The narrator then dives into the history surrounding Piper's mother, but carefully, using cautious wording and referencing accusations instead of stating anything as fact. They explain how, for years, people online have claimed that Piper's mom pushed boundaries for the sake of views, claims of inappropriate behavior during filming, pressure on minors in her content squad, even legal cases involving former members. The narrator stresses how these allegations didn't start yesterday. They've been circulating since Piper was a child. The narrator describes how this pattern of accusations makes the current situation feel less like a sudden downfall and more like a long-term consequence of adults allegedly prioritizing money and views over the well-being of a child. And as they move forward, they ask a quiet but powerful question. If these warnings were everywhere, why did nothing change? The narrator takes a wider view, stepping back from Piper's individual story to explore the larger pattern that online investigators have been exposing for years. They explain how professionals like cybersecurity investigator Ryan Montgomery found evidence that many teen influencers get prepped for adult content long before they turn 18. Old links quietly repurposed, fan pages rebranded, bios updated the second the birthday hits. The narrator explains how this creates a disturbing blueprint, one where a minor doesn't even realize what they're being guided toward until it's too late. And when viewers compare that blueprint to Piper's timeline, the resemblance becomes impossible to ignore. The narrator stresses that this isn't about blaming a teenager, it's about exposing the machinery around her. In the last section, the narrator's voice softens, carrying a mixture of sadness and frustration. They explain that Piper didn't choose all of this. She grew up in a life built on cameras, edits, thumbnails, and marketing strategies long before she was old enough to grasp the consequences. The narrator describes how her privacy was taken from her piece by piece, screen-recorded, reposted, and consumed by strangers. They reflect on how the childhood she could have had was replaced by content schedules and controversies. And then they leave viewers with a lingering question, one that forces them to think beyond the drama. When a child is raised in a world where their entire identity becomes monetized, who is truly at fault when that child turns 18 and follows the path laid out for them? The narrator ends not with judgment, but with a reminder that behind every headline is a human being who never got the chance to choose freely.